Mayor, we have connected to the online and we are recording the meeting. We are good to go.
Great, thank you. Welcome everybody to the Planning Coordination Advisory Committee of May 25th, 2022. I will take roll. Councilmember Sonia Miles here, and Board Member Takis Harrington. I could read name, I can't say it. And Supervisor Walter Alcorn.
Here.
Supervisor Sylvia Glass. Supervisor Margaret Franklin, I believe, is joining us online. Is that correct?
Yes, I am here.
And can you tell us where you are and why?
Sure, I am in, yes, I am in Northern Virginia for personal reasons.
Okay, thank you. And Councilmember Sarah Bagley here. And Councilmember Phil Duncan.
Here.
Councilmember John Steely.
Here.
Vice Mayor Pamela Sebesky is not here, and Councilmember Ralph Smith is here in her place. And nice for you to join us. Vice Mayor Preston Banks. He's going to be a little later this evening. Council Member Signe Fredericks is here, and Vice Mayor Marty Martinez. Not here. Okay, and Councilmember Stanley Milan, I believe he is also joining us electronically. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello, good evening. And can you just tell us where you are and why you are participating electronically this evening?
I am out of the country in the Philippines, and it's 6:30 in the morning here for family reasons.
Okay, all right, thank you. Wonderful. All right, well, we will get started. First thing on the agenda is the summary notes of April 27th, 2022. Did anyone see any changes that they would like to make to those summary notes? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, anyone opposed? All right, those pass. The status of the transaction plan update, Mr. Jasper. There you are.
Good evening, Chair and
Good
members of the committee. Nice to be with you again. I'm not going to talk for very long because I'm joined with our consultant, Tom Harrington, who's going to take you through an initial set of analyses from the work that's being done for transaction, the long-range plan. I know that the 6-year program is ongoing and was the subject of conversation at last month's meeting and will be on your agenda for next month's meeting. But at the moment, we're in a period of time where we're reviewing public comment and doing other analyses, just wrapping up before making recommendations. So this is a perfect opportunity to bring you up to date on transaction, which is our other primary responsibility here at MBTA. And we'll be looking for you to take some action on transaction later this year during the fall. So we wanted to get you up to speed now on some of the detailed content. So I'll hand over to Tom to take you through it.
So we've got a lot of material here. I'll probably be going through fairly quickly. Folks have questions, just stop me, and we can answer any questions that come up. Let's see. So I think we're going to start with slide 5. Okay. So just kind of give an update of where we are on transaction. So back in the fall, we were here talking to you and the other committees about goals, performance measures, and then ultimately the authority approved a set of weights to go with those measures, I think in December. So since that time, we've been doing a variety of activities with the project team. There was a transportation perception survey that was done in December. You may have seen the results that came out a few months ago. We actually started to use the new transaction model that was developed last year for this initial testing of the 6-year program. And then now that same model is being used for a transaction, as you'll hear about tonight. We've got a web post series for the project. So we're putting some of the information from the study up on the transaction website. So you can take a look at that to get some more information. And then really tonight, I'll be talking about some of the project modeling and analysis. So there've been a variety of meetings now in May as we start to bring this information out. There was a stakeholder meeting a few weeks ago presenting some of the similar material. There was an authority work session last week. So all this is sort of getting everyone up to speed on transaction, what's happening. This summer, we'll start a public comment period with the hearing in the fall, and then in November, the authority will approve the transaction plan. That's kind of at a high level what's happening. On that, we'll just jump right in then. So the transaction project list consists of a variety of transportation projects from large to small. We'll kind of break that down here. There's two main categories. We've got we call bottom-up projects, which come from local plans and sort of sponsored by the local jurisdictions that come out of approved plans. And then we have top-down projects, which really are projects to address regional needs that after we've looked at the complete set of projects, if there are any gaps, we identified needs, and there's a set of projects to go with those. So you see more bottom-up than top-down. The large list, 111 of those are new projects. The remainder are ones that have kind of been brought over from prior transaction. Although with some projects coming off the list, it ends up being a net of 77 projects. The total estimated cost of this entire portfolio is over $70 billion. We're going to look at that in a little more detail. 26 of the projects include elements outside of Northern Virginia. Those are include transit service, such as Metro and DRE. It also includes connections, infrastructure improvements into other jurisdictions, namely bridge improvements over the river. So if you look at those projects that have elements outside of Northern Virginia, that's over 29 billion. So, a large chunk of the 70 billion are just a smaller subset of projects. Next few slides break that down in terms of the number of projects by which jurisdiction or which agency is sponsoring them. You can see the breakdown by county, by city and town here. And to the right, though, we've got some larger numbers that include the top-down projects. They came from the project team. We also have multi-agency, which includes combinations of VDOT and some of the local, or it could be WMATA and a local jurisdiction kind of sponsoring a project. So that gives you a feel for where the projects came from. The next slide shows breakdown by costs. And here it's apparent, we talk about 70 billion. It's really in a handful of areas where there's some very large projects, and namely you can see WMATA, the 26 billion is a big chunk of that. That's we'll look at some of the improvements really to address port capacity, particularly the Roslyn bottleneck, are in there and are part of why that's such a big number. There's also a number of multi-agency projects mentioned. Okay, next. And then next slide really just kind of shows those together. So you can see, for example, Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William County have the largest in terms of the number of projects. When you look at it by dollars, they're also significant, but that, WMATA is kind of the opposite situation, just a few projects, which add up to a pretty big chunk of the dollars there. Okay. The next slide gives you a sense of the breakdown by project type. So the primary project, each project has a primary type, or what its primary purpose is, but then also can have secondary purposes. But when we look at the primary type, you can see roadway, they're at about 46% of the projects. Transit is about a quarter. Then you've got bike ped and intersection improvements being two of the other larger areas in terms of where projects are assigned as a project type. There's also TDM, HOV lane improvements, ITS, and parking. Let's see. The next slide is kind of bring this down a little bit more when we bring in the other types. For example, bike ped may not be listed as the primary type, but on many roadway projects, bike ped might be an important secondary element of the project. And so that's in the next slide there. The bike ped shares a little bit larger in slide 12. Keep going. Yeah, so then we can look at how it breaks down a little bit by the size of the project. You kind of see the distribution where we've got a number of projects, particularly in the 10 to $50 million range. There's certainly quite a few that are smaller than 10 million. And then we've got on the far right some, a number of very big projects that are over $500 million. So it's really a read, across the spectrum of different costs there. But important to keep that in mind when we talk about some of the improvements. Really can range from very large to very small.
And if I may just jump in here, just a reminder that transaction is a fiscally unconstrained plan. So this is looking at every project that's out there that's regional in nature, addressing regional needs in some shape or form is what's on this list. But there is no funding commitment associated with any of these projects by virtue of inclusion in transaction. It is a basis for doing analysis, but it is not a funding commitment. So, which is just as well because, to our knowledge, the authority does not have, will not have, through 2045, $70+ billion to spend. So it begs the question, well, which ones? But that's not a discussion for tonight.
The last slide in this section just looks at, again, the project type and then brings in both the count and then the cost. So you get a sense, like the green there being roadway, where it's about the same whether you're looking at number or cost, but for transit, the number is smaller, the dollar is bigger. Again, that's heavily weighted by a few very large metro and theory projects that are part of why that number changes there. But this gives you kind of the breakdown by project type in terms of the average cost of projects. Get a sense of that as well. So that was a quick overview of the types of breakdown of projects that are in the as inputs to the planning process there. Any questions on that?
Yes, Supervisor Alcorn.
Thank you, Chairwoman. WMATA. Did you use the BOS study as the input? In which scenario did you use?
Right. Yeah. So we do have in there the I'm probably not going to get the alternative right, but yeah, it's the blue, orange, silver. One of the alternatives, blue line realignment, basically, and that is approximately 20 billion of what we're looking at here. So it's a large price tag.
Yeah.
With that one.
And I just point out, I chair NBTC's WMATA committee, and NBTC just sent a letter to WMATA basically saying, fix the Roslyn Tunnel first. It's been a capacity issue for years. And, it's such a long way before Metro would basically adopt a locally preferred alternative. At least that's my understanding. I guess my question is, are there other projects in there that are as shaky as that one in terms of their size and whether or not they will actually be put forward? Or significant number of other
I think it's difficult for Tom to answer because it depends what you mean by shaky. And I think it's certainly true that the larger a project is in terms of dollars, the harder it becomes, particularly one that is in Virginia, the district, and in Maryland, or some two out of those three, because apart from the engineering feasibility and the cost, there's the question of how you come up with a funding strategy given other priorities. So yeah, I mean, I think it's probably true to say that the bigger the project and the more jurisdictions involved in it, the harder it becomes to implement. But that's not to say it's not an impactful project. And one of the key things to keep in mind about the Blue Orange Silver Line project is that in addition to Roslyn, it does address a number of core capacity issues that WMATA has consistently cited over at least 5 years now, maybe longer. But without those core capacity issues being addressed, there can be no new metro rail extensions in Northern Virginia. It's just
Well,
a complete no.
That's true of the Roslyn Tunnel. And
Right.
there's some other pieces along the blue line.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stations that the Blue, Orange, Silver Line in total would address some of those stations, but even then it would not address all of the core capacity issues on, say, the Red Line.
Right. And there are some issues about the Yellow Line Bridge and other things that could be done
Yes.
to
Yes.
manage some of those capacity issues. But anyway, part of my question is just that's such a big chunk of this.
Yes.
And it's such, the concepts are so raw and not discussed at all.
And Supervisor Elkhorn, what I would say to that, this is a 2025 year plan, but we update it every 5 years, so the finalization of some of those concepts may not materialize in this transaction, but when we do the next transaction, even though we have the authority adopted every 5 years for staff, it's every 2.5 year cycle for us. So those concepts may come to fruition so that we can have more final level of detail. Where it really matters is when you receive an application for funding. Because even though we are showing $71.1 billion for the capital investment, that seems like the right number, but the reality is, with inflation and cost of materials and things of that nature, it could be off a little bit. And that's where the funding program comes in, but you are right. A lot of this, I won't call it aspirational, but we do have projects in Maryland and American Legion Bridge and some river crossing that we can't pay for, but because transaction is needs-based, it was important to improve.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so the next part of the presentation starts to take a look at some of the initial results. And these projects we were just describing are coded in a network and tested using a modeling framework. On the next slide, we'll look at sort of, when we talk about the network, we compare everything here against a 2045 no build. So it's 2045 everything compared with 2045 no build. So there's a lot of change that happens between today and 2045 that were part of what we looked at when we did our needs assessment. But this is really strictly 2045 versus 2045 that we'll be looking at here. So it starts with projects that are in the region's constrained long range plan that TPB maintains, but then keeps projects that are fully funded within Northern Virginia by MBTA, but takes out projects that are on our build list. So we could see those changes when we look at the build versus the no build. So we'll talk tonight about full build. We're also doing a whole series of model runs, testing by mode, testing in groups. Ultimately, there'll be transaction project scores for each project. So that's kind of work that's ongoing right now. And so just at a high level, we look at some of the metrics here to see some of the changes. The changes in trips are fairly modest. And again, that's because we're working with the same land use. It's all 2045. So we don't have big shifts in the number of trips. There is some shift from auto to transit, given all the investment in transit that we're looking at here. There's slight increases in both person miles traveled and vehicle miles traveled. We're putting more capacity on the network so people are able to take more trips or travel more on the network. So that's why those go up. Where you see the benefits is really under some of the performance measures that are used in transactions. So delay reduction down by 16%, the duration of congestion by 24%, and then increases in accessibility, the number of jobs you can get to, within a reasonable time. And that's looked at both for all of Northern Virginia and then specifically for equity emphasis areas, looking at how residents of those zones can reach jobs. And there's a slightly higher increase in accessibility for those areas. Given the increase in DMT, there's also an increase in emissions. Ultimately, that's a measure we'd like to see go down, but with the increase in travel under the full build, emissions would go up slightly. So these are
Excuse me,
Yeah.
it says emissions reduction.
Correct, yeah.
So
So,
that if reductions go up, doesn't that mean emissions go down?
yeah, that's why I was trying to clarify that. The measure is emissions reduction, meaning that's the benefit we want to show. In this case, it's showing an increase. So, well, I know, it's labeled funny, it'd probably be safer just to call it emissions.
Maybe you should say emissions increase.
Or, yeah, or just
Right.
emissions. Okay.
Or we could just call it,
Clarify.
could just call it emissions.
Yeah, exactly. But in this case, the positive means it's an increase.
Okay. Oh, you're saying.
And then, again, as when we looked at the measures list previously, as we continue the analysis, there's some other things that we're looking at more at the individual project level, things like the quality of access to transit and the quality of the bike network due to the project, potential for safety improvements for different projects. Those are done more qualitatively based on a set of factors, so it can really only be done at the project level. We're also looking at transit in dedicated right-of-way. And then we have a measure looking at system redundancy based on how the network does with the surge in demand. So those are all things that will be added sort of to this summary of results.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
To get back to the emissions reduction issue,
Thank you.
why would we, if I'm understanding this correctly, this is what we anticipate the result of the projects that we build to be.
If
We
put everything in
anticipate
there.
a 1.4% increase in emissions. Why would we allow that? Where we need to decrease our emissions. And we're not, is this just, that's the way it has to be, or?
No, what Tom is showing here is that the analysis of all those projects compared to doing with none of those projects is to increase emissions by that amount. That's not to say that's what anyone wants to do, but it's the first data point to understand the analysis is telling us the impact of those projects, but that doesn't make those projects preferred, recommended, or anything. It's a data point.
So we just take all of the projects that have been submitted and they all happen, then there will be an increase in emissions.
That's what was happening. Yeah.
Right. And I should know, we can't do individual project modeling for the long range plan. We just don't have the resources. And this is why Tom and Keith are saying all of the projects.
But we're not tasked with decreasing emissions? Is that?
We definitely want to decrease emissions, but what he's saying is all of the projects in all 429. What we don't know which projects are tipping the scale because we don't have the resources for the long range plan to go in and do individual project modeling. We're looking at the transportation network.
So will we attempt to offset this at some point, or are we just?
Well, that's when it gets to the funding program.
Okay.
And that's where we do the individual project modeling. And that's where we can show whether how projects are performing individually on emissions reduction.
Okay.
But he's saying build all projects and transact all 429, which we are not going to do. We cannot legally do. There would be an increase in emissions.
And Tom's going to talk a little bit more further in the presentation about some scenario sensitivity analysis that we've done, so that'll shed a little bit more light on it.
Under different other situations, inputs, you will see emissions reductions. We'll take a look at that as well.
Okay, wait, did you want to say something?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just a methodological thing so that I keep it in mind. So we are, the emissions are based on traffic or the use of the, it's not embodied carbon and, you know, the emissions that come with infrastructure building and all this.
This is, the emissions that are really derived from the vehicle miles traveled. More cars on the road.
So I do that, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
One follow-up question on that. Do you include reductions of emissions because of electrification of the vehicle fleets, or is that built into the model?
This is basically our baseline network. This includes reductions from today based on technology. We're going to look at a scenario that has more dramatic changes due to technology as a separate sensitivity test.
So that the model doesn't currently assume electrification of
It does assume a small percent, which is going to increase in the 2045 baseline, and then we'll look at a scenario where it's a much higher percentage of electrification.
Okay, thank you.
Next few slides show this a little more graphically. Again, because we're looking at everything put together, at times this looks a little bit like spaghetti because we've got the whole network here. It's a little easier to see when you're really focused in on one project at a time, but here on this graphic here, the red is increases, blue decreases. Red links are really those where there's been a capacity enhancement, or in some cases, a new segment or something like that. That would all show up as red. Generally, we see some traffic shifting to where the improvement is, shifting off some of the parallel roads. So that's the general pattern that we see. And you can see, given the very long list of projects spread throughout the region, you generally see both, increases and decreases across the entire region. The slide after this shows where that translates into delay. I will say there's a few links that with sensitivity, probably we're talking very small changes, but you can see, again, places where there might have been an increase, some slight increases in delay, other places in blue where there's a decrease in delay. So that kind of tracks with where we saw the volume shifts. Next set of slides are getting into the accessibility. As I mentioned earlier, this is locations where the number of jobs accessible by auto increases. And for auto, we're looking at what you can get to within 45 minutes. So with the set of projects that we're talking about, on average, increases are in the order of magnitude of 180,000 jobs you can get to, or about a 13% increase in what you can get to by auto in the network with these improvements. And so in the map on the right there, the progressively darker shading gets at sort of greater numbers of jobs you can reach with the improvements in the network. So that one shows you for the auto side. On transit, we're looking at within 60 minutes. There are increases really across the region, though it's a little bit lower percent, 6% increase in accessibility. And as you can see here, tends to be focused a little more on the east side of the region, which corresponds to where a number of the improvements that we're looking at, particularly in the Route 1 and I-95 corridor, we've got a series of projects too. So, so you can see that as well. And as mentioned, we looked at it for both all zones and then specifically for equity emphasis areas. So it's roughly the same, but slightly higher for equity emphasis areas.
How do you calculate jobs? Like, how do you count 44,000 jobs? Because I mean, 44,000 is a lot. I mean, true, it's only 6%, but that's quite a bit. What do you look at as a job?
Yeah, right, where someone works. So this is again using the cooperative forecasts that have population jobs that are done by the council government. So as you can see on the map there, each of those are little traffic analysis zones. So for each of those zones, we're saying how many jobs could you get to by transit within 60 minutes, meaning anywhere in the region, not just in Northern Virginia, but in DC or Maryland as well. Could you get there in 60 minutes? That would be a job you can get to. The 44,000 is more than when we average it over the entire region, it ends up being an average increase of 44,000. But you can see through the legend there, we have some zones that are more than 250,000 jobs in increase.
Just to follow up, the COG model is based on our respective comprehensive plans, right? And then it's time-based over some period of time.
Yeah, the actual forecasts out to 2045 are from the cooperative forecast of the jurisdiction. Put together.
How does that factor of residential changing patterns of residential settlements?
Yeah, and population is a key input to the modeling as well, and they also track how the number of households changes because we're getting smaller household size in the future, has been on a trend. So we get sometimes the households and populations changes at a slightly different rate. But
so the aspirations to build more for housing somehow factored into the model.
by each jurisdiction in terms of that balance between population and jobs.
As much as it's already captured in your plan, local plans, comprehensive plans.
So here we're really just using those as inputs to the travel model to see how that translates into the transportation and travel within the region and some of these benefits that we're looking at. But a good point that accessibility is very much dependent not just on the travel time, but very much on where the jobs are, where the population is. And so we're keeping land use the same in this. We're looking at 2045 versus 2045. So we're not changing jobs and population within this comparison. This is really just due to the transportation projects. Obviously, if we were looking at different land use scenarios, then this accessibility measure would change just due to the land use change also. And then the third map we have here is the bike network. As part of the set of top-down projects, one of the things that Transaction is looking at is we're sort of building a network of really high quality, or we call them low stress bike routes that includes off-road trails. And so one of the set of the top-down projects are looking at connections in that regional trail network. So those are highlighted in green on the map. But this is looking at how does that affect how many jobs you could get to by bike within 30 minutes. And so you see some of the gains there too. This tends to be a little more clustered kind of inside the Beltway. So you see a lot more in Arlington, Alexandria. And that's partly geography that you can get to. If you can get, say, to downtown Washington within 30 minutes, suddenly you have access to a much bigger job market. So some of that is simply the geography of the network. But you do see gains along those routes where we're showing bike trails. Any follow-up question to that? In the third part of the presentation, now let's keep in mind what you just saw as sort of the future baseline, which is the cooperative forecast up to 2045, comparing the full build network against the no build. In this set of scenarios, we're going to look at other sort of changes in travel, how those might affect results. Next slide. Because we know we live in very uncertain times, and so particularly when you talk about the year 2045, we know that a lot can change. Yet the travel models that we use take past travel behavior and say, well, people travel in the future the way they've been traveling. What does that look like? This allows us to basically look at what happens if some of the assumptions change. So these are what we're calling plausible futures, but not necessarily preferred or predicted. We're not asking anyone to pick a scenario, it's simply to allow us to see how sensitive the results are to changes in different assumptions or inputs. This also can help us look at the set of projects and see how those perform under different scenarios to get a sense of, well, if something changed, which projects maybe look like they perform best under different scenarios, under different conditions. So there are three that have been created so far here. A pandemic created a new normal, which is what if the travel behavior we've seen in the last couple of years extends into the future. So that's one. Transportation technology, so looking at particularly some of the connected autonomous vehicles and electric vehicle technology. What happens, what's the impact of those technologies? And then the third one, the policy and mechanisms, is really looking at some pricing and incentives, see how that could change travel behavior. So tonight, we're looking at what could happen to transportation by 2045. The upper left is basically what we just looked at, which is the standard forecast using the travel model and the cooperative forecasts. Then we're looking at these three scenarios, which suggest how results might be a little bit different under these three scenarios. Tonight's discussion is really keeping the network as the no-build network. So we're just looking at the impact of those different factors on no build. Second part of this we'll come back to talk about is what happens to the build projects under different scenarios also. And that'll help us understand how projects perform under different conditions also. So the first scenario, this post-pandemic new normal. So what if trends observed during the pandemic continue into the long-term future? And some of the key assumptions that are based on observed travel that's been happening and surveys and such. Reduction of work-related trips by 21%. And so that's an average number over typical weekdays. So that's in effect assuming that if you look at the mix of jobs and people that can telecommute and how many days per week people will actually telecommute, we're ending up with a number of 21%, which could be a little conservative, but that's based on kind of the mix of jobs that's out there right now and what we're expecting to see people do. That's where we ended up. Reduction of in-person shopping trips by 5%, but an increase in delivery trips, shopping that's done online where you get a delivery, that's increasing. An increase in non-motorized trips, because we've seen an increase in bike and walking trips during the pandemic. And with all the scenarios, we're not changing land use, so that part of it will be constant.
Madam Chair, could I, on that last point, no changes in land use plans, right? Or are you saying no new development?
No change in that baseline cooperative forecast. So
right. So basically, our comp plans are being built out. Right.
We, as the authority, do not control land use. That we know land use is a local decision. And Tom, when you say cooperative forecast, that's please emphasize that is what the planning director from your respective localities came together and really voted and agreed that this is what we think based on our own comp.
Just to add to the reason why Tom's put that bullet there is that's our assumption. But that's not to say that the new normal wouldn't cause land use changes to happen. We're just assuming there'll be none. I think we probably believe there will be land use changes, but we're not assuming it.
Right, because the COG model does not assume these changes. It's the same.
That's true. Although we have the ability, since we have our own version of the model, to actually to move the land use around. We're just choosing not to.
And Councilor Stewie has a question.
Thank you very much. Just a quick clarification. I'm fascinated with this increase in delivery trips model and would very much like to understand how we affirm, test, or what data you're using to drive that in. As background, we just put an Amazon Fresh in the city of Fairfax, and it's amazing how it immediately changed my grocery habits in a way I did not anticipate changing them because of how just fantastic it was in different spaces. So I'm very interested in that concept in particular because 80% of their employees are for delivery only, which blew my mind when they put it up there. And that's just one example. So I'd love to delve into that a little more.
And again, with any of these assumptions that we're looking at, there are assumptions, and really what we're testing is how sensitive are the results to changing the assumptions. We're not saying these are exactly what's going to happen, because no one knows at this point some of this stuff where we're going to end up, but we see the directions that we're going. So the next one on technology is really focused on changes in vehicle technology. We know over time we're going to continue to see an increase in the percent of the fleet that have features that are connected, automated, electric certainly, and then shared, which we've seen for TNCs, things like Uber and Lyft. We're expecting to see more of that where there'll be more shared use of vehicles. So some of the assumptions here are that while these sort of fully connected automated vehicles will be 100% used for the TNCs, for the shared services, that in terms of private use, there'll be 20%. So it won't be the whole fleet, but it will be, a significant percentage of it. Similarly with trucks, large trucks, it's a third. So there's going to be market penetration, but it's not like the entire truck fleet will suddenly become automated in the future. Transit buses are not assumed to be automated, and that's been debated sort of where we'll end up. Some of that is the driving conditions of driving a city bus. Some of it is also thinking about labor considerations, about which jobs will there be in the future or not. So for now, we're assuming those are not automated. But there will be some shuttle buses which are fully automated, that may be slow moving shuttles, say to a metro station that can go through a neighborhood and get people
Seem like
there. Just like, yeah,
Right,
right
I
in the
didn't think
neighborhood.
about that, right.
Because the assumption that all these sort of new automated vehicles will be electric, the percentage of electric vehicles in this scenario is higher than the other scenarios. We also have lower operating costs, and that's just the nature of, generally like today, taxi is the most expensive in terms of what you're paying per mile. And TNCs today, where you have a driver, are expensive. But as we look at the case vehicle, these automated vehicles, that brings the cost down more. So that's factored in when we look at how much it costs to go, a certain distance in the model. And some other changes related to these vehicles, that when we have automated vehicles out there, we expect the owners of those vehicles to make more trips and longer trips because suddenly they can multitask behind the wheel, under this scenario. With zero occupancy vehicle, we also have the potential for remote parking of private vehicles. So if you get dropped off by your vehicle and your vehicle goes and parks itself. So that's something that can happen with this technology. And then, we'll see other changes. Capacity increase is one that's talked about a lot. We see that being a bigger deal on freeways, where you'll be able to use the technology to get more vehicles closer together when they're all connected and automated. Lower percentage on the major arterials, and that's partly due to how many of the vehicles will be on there and just kind of how they'll be used, but you can actually get the capacity improvements. And we mentioned the shuttles, and again, using no land use change in this scenario.
Thank you for being here.
Hearing you through a different device.
All right, good luck.
I'm not going to be in the zone. So you're in a zone with John, here, Ariel. Drone certainly for delivery of things, but even passenger, small scale aerial vehicles.
Focused on surface transportation here, but you could argue that the case vehicle type of vehicle, which is fully automated, we're assuming they're on the roads, and I guess maybe some very small percentage of that could be aerial. I don't know.
Right.
If I may, I guess it's a good opportunity. Several of us had the chance to attend a briefing at MITRE that I mentioned earlier, which I thought was fascinating, and we're looking to continue that conversation. I really would encourage folks to think about it. As of today, Richmond announced they're going to pilot delivery from Walmart via unmanned area vehicles. And so I do think that I was certainly swayed by their analysis of what the future will hold for aerial. That is a game changer. And in fact, I'll turn back to you for like literally rethinking the way you're planning your next 10 years to have that vertical takeoff port available to go back and forth. They're working with FAA and others. So I really think that's coming. To me, I see that being before my car goes and parks itself. I see aerial being more realistic as I think about the technology in my comfort zone. So I do think that's a game changer.
Maybe we're all kind of making all some of our results. I'm going to just go back and ahead.
So I'm curious, in this scenario, and we haven't gotten yet to like what the various impacts are, but I was, if we have increased under this scenario, the cars are heavier and there are more of them making more trips. So is that factored in somehow, like the wear and tear on the roads and sort of the road maintenance costs? Because I may be getting a little sideways on what it is you were studying here, but just being conscious of costs and impact, I'm just curious, was that factored in some way, the increased impact on the actual surface roads?
Not at this time, and not in the results we're going to look at tonight, which are really, when I said operating costs, it's really the cost to the driver, to the person using it. But you're right, some of those life cycle costs certainly would have impacts in the long term, but aren't considering what we're talking about here.
But you raise a good point, because traditionally the Commonwealth uses gas tax
Right.
revenues for maintenance. And as EVs come into the market, gas tax is going to continue to go down. And they're going to have to be able to compensate for that because the wear and tear on the road, I don't see that.
And then as you add in this automated features that allow for even increased density on the road, it is, if I'm understanding what you're saying about automated capacity increase. So, we're gonna have less funds,
Yes.
less revenue for what might be more poundage on the roads. So I appreciate it's not a part of what you're analyzing here, but I can't help but be conscious of the connection. Yeah.
Supervisor Alpert?
Yeah, I was just gonna say what Councilman Duncan said. I agree. The next 20 years, we're gonna start seeing significant people movement through vertical weed. So I would suggest, if not now, in the next year or so, incorporate that. Because I think for scenario analysis,
I think it's a really good idea. I would suggest that probably for us, the best way to deal with that is through our transportation technology strategic plan, where we do drill down into these things in much more detail, and then use any update to that strategic plan to feed back into transaction. This transaction is kind of like very broad, but can't go very deep because of its nature. But a transportation technology strategic plan can go quite a bit deeper on technology.
Okay, and the third scenario, which we're talking about how we're going to pay for everything in the future, gets into incentives and pricing. So this one really looks at what if pricing was changed throughout the region, and in particular we add BMT pricing on all roads. So that's added. There is an assumption here that there'd be a discount for lower income households in terms of how this is applied to driving. But so increase in BMT pricing, increase in parking costs as well, which are shown in the graphic on the right. So areas basically with more density would have increased parking costs as well. Based on a trend we've seen during the pandemic, free transit, which a number of transit agencies actually have moved towards. And also we've added this assumption about shift in travel time from peak hours, which mimics an incentive program like RM3P, which would look at, well, what if you incentivize people to change when they go and use capacity that's unused kind of in the shoulder or the off peak. So all those things are brought into this third scenario. Okay, we'll get results now. So I guess the first one here is the post-pandemic new normal. We see a drop in the total number of motorized person trips. And when we say motorized, that means either auto or transit. Anyone who's not biking or walking would be motorized. So a drop in those trips, a much bigger drop specifically in transit trips. That's because in our assumptions, we have bigger impact on work trips, and work is a higher percentage of transit. So just by nature of, and this is something we've seen already during the pandemic, that transit is taking a bigger hit than what we're seeing on the road. 4% drop in DMT based on those shifts, and a 14% drop in first hours of delay. So we see some more of that telecommuting like we've been seeing, and some of those other changes we have there. You can see the kinds of impact.
And sure. So it's new normal versus no bill. So that means we don't spend the 70 billion.
Right.
Right.
But we still see the comp plans being built out in development.
Yeah.
Wow. All right.
To keep in mind, none of us have any control over this.
Oh, I know. Wow. Okay.
The next scenario is the technology one. And so on this one, we also see a drop in person trips and a big drop in transit trips. This is due more to shifting, to the shared use vehicles. So we see a higher increase of shared use. We see more people shifting out of transit into shared use vehicle for the point-to-point type service provided. So that part of it is a little similar to what we saw in the the last scenario. A little less decrease in VMT, because as we mentioned, some of these vehicles will be taking more trips and longer trips, the automated ones. We do see a big drop in person hours of delay, and that's due to that capacity increase, that we're able to use our roads more efficiently by having the technology, and that leads to bigger decreases in delay. So that's the second one. And then in the third one, where we look at pricing, here we see a drop in motorized trips, but we actually see a big increase in transit trips. That's, again, we've made driving more expensive, we've made transit free. And so there you see the shift over to transit from auto, big drop in VMT, less people on the roads, and a 20% drop in person hours of delay. So that kind of gives you sense of that. And the next slide kind of puts all three together so you can see how they stack up. And in addition to the measures that I already talked about, there's a few more on this one. We look at duration of severe congestion, which is even a bigger decrease, I mean, than the person hours of delay, where we have that most severe congestion. We see job accessibility gains under all three of these. That's primarily due to the delay reduction. We have basically less delay so people can get to more things. And then emissions, coming back to our emissions thing. So these are all decreases in emissions, not an increase in emissions. And the big one is the technology one, 28% drop in emissions. Showing that with that higher penetration of electric vehicles, you get big drops in emissions. So any questions on those?
Yeah, Supervisor.
I'm just looking at these numbers compared to the full build out slides, 19. You're not making a strong case to spend $70 billion. I'll just put it that way. I mean, I know we don't control any.
That's the third one. Government at some level does have control over that. I'm not saying that's MBTA, but that's more a feature of government policy. See that federal, state, regional, local. I'd also throw out there pricing. We often get pushback when we use the word pricing, and here, what Tom described, although he didn't really do a hard sell on it, is that every time you get in your car and drive somewhere, you will be charged for driving. But think about this: as we move to increasing levels of penetration of electric vehicles, the sustainability of transportation funding, be that at federal or state level, and regional, local to some extent as well, that sustainability begins to go away. So you can't, on the one hand, be enthusiastic about electric vehicles without, on the other hand, having some compensatory revenue stream. So a VMT fee, or sometimes referred to as a mileage-based user fee, perhaps to make it more palatable, I'm not sure. Some sort of fee for driving will be necessary if you want a high penetration of electric vehicles. It's just a fact, unless there's some other source of transportation funding which miraculously comes from somewhere.
Councilmember Steely, and then.
Just a quick kind of gut check on here. The technology assumptions do not square with my understanding of where the technology is. And we had a great briefing at MITRE on there. We are going to announce here shortly some additional work we're doing in the city to look at it. And I would just encourage us to take this assumption out and test it with some folks who are doing it. I really believe that where we think we are from automation and where the market actually is a much bigger gap than I originally thought a couple of years ago. And I don't think in my kid's lifetime, you're going to see fully autonomous driving vehicles. And I say that because I know where the technology is, where the concerns are, and I think that has a foundational impact on the assumptions you're making here. I'm happy to be proven wrong. It's just one person's opinion, but I really would want to stress test that, particularly with 25% emission reduction being the larger numbers. It just doesn't sit right as a gut. So for what it's worth, I think you're looking for feedback tonight. That one strikes me as off, I guess is the way I would phrase it.
that is helpful. I mean, we stated our assumptions, and they are assumptions. We're not saying we're right, and that's definitely not prediction. And there is a wide range of opinion on where we will actually land in 2045. Excuse the pun with the aerial thing. But yeah, no, point taken.
Yeah, Councilor.
So yeah, I have 3 questions. The first one is, it seems most likely to me, and I'm wondering if this is the assumption also by you, is that of the 3 scenarios, the 3 alternative scenarios that you've given us, whatever we end up with is going to be a mixture of all of them. It's not going to be so. But that leads me to wonder, where is the difference between this and the original one, the full build out with the known changes? What is the difference? Why was there an increase in emissions with that one and a significant decrease in this one? Is there a road project in there that's?
Yes, there are quite a few road projects. You know, as we go back to that breakdown of roadway projects, all that increased capacity meant more travel, both on transit and highway. We had an increase in VMT, and even though we'll have a higher percent of electric vehicles, if there's more VMT, more travel on the roads, unless there was a big change in electric vehicles, you'd see a increase in emissions. So again, I think on the electric vehicle percentage, that was another one where there are some numbers floating out there that'll be very high percentage of electric vehicles. I think we ended up using a number that was a little bit lower on electric vehicle percentage. So that's another one of those assumptions that we can be clear about what it is, and just whether you agree with it or disagree. That does help drive those numbers too.
And another question I had was that the electric vehicles get there. This is not really a local regional thing, but I think it should be put out there. When you fill your tank or whatever, your battery up with electricity, the electricity is being generated somewhere, and wherever it's being generated is creating emissions unless it's in a power plant. We don't have a lot of nuclear power plants. So even if we're decreasing emissions in our area, they're increasing in some other area. So that's not a net decrease to my knowledge at this point. It's more important in this area and also in other large cities or megalopolises that they have lower emissions because there's such a quantity of vehicles. But if we're looking at it from an environmental point of view, I have my questions. Thank you.
Anyone else?
And just maybe one more slide here was just to wrap up. We are continuing to look at how the projects perform, looking across our performance measures. We are summarize those results kind of a little more at the quarter level, just to get a feel for how it impacts things, not just at the regional level. We're looking at how individual projects would do on a rough sort of rating scale. And then we'll this last step of the scenario analysis is looking at how the projects do under the 3 scenarios also. So that's all work that's still underway. And again, there'll be more information coming out this summer.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay. So next on the agenda is the status of the FY 2022-2027 6-year program updates.
Thank you, Chair Howard and members. I don't have any presentation. We discussed the evaluation in detail at the last meeting. At that time, we were already into the public comment period. Public comment period ended last Sunday. We are going through all the comments we received and compiling them to make sure we correctly log them and understand what public says, which projects are getting supported, which is there any opposition to the project. We are doing that analysis now. On a rough estimate, we had 400 plus individuals commenting. Many of them commented on multiple projects, so it's not a one-on-one relation. So we probably have about 1,000 plus project level comments from about 400 plus people. We are still going through the analysis and to hopefully by next week, we have some sort of report on that. We are hoping to bring it to the authority meeting first and then subsequently to these committees. And once we have this public comment evaluation also understood, we will bring that information into the technical evaluation we talked about at the last meeting, and then prepare some sort of staff recommendation for which projects we funded. And then we will bring it to this committee and technical advisory committee at your next meeting. Subsequently, once you two meet, then we take it to the planning and programming committee. They will then bring all these things together and have a recommendation for the authority. And authority, we expect authority to take action at their July meeting.
Thank you. Any questions on that? Okay, thank you. And NBT update?
Madam Chair, I have none. Well, General Assembly will reconvene June 1, and we will see what happens.
Okay, anyone else, any further comments or questions? Okay, motion to adjourn, anyone?
Sorry, their next meeting is.
Oh, that next meeting, I'm sorry, is June 22nd.
Yes, please. The public comments, are they public somewhere? If I want to just.
Not yet, as I said, we are compiling them and making sure we capture everyone, not missing anything or misrepresenting. We want to go through the quality assurance process, and then, yes, we will publish all that in our website.
The authority will probably see them first, so when we do, in just the inside baseball, when we do the posting for the June authority meeting packet, that information will be available.
So they'll need 1 second.
June 22nd.
No.
Oh, the authority?
Oh,
June
sorry.
9th? I think it's June 9th, but we get the packet out and post it a week before. So if you check the website, a week beforehand, you will see the summary of the public comment. Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Yeah.
I hope we adjourn.
Is there a second? Second. All righty. Meeting adjourned. Thank you for coming, everybody. Questions, comments? You would call?
I need a big one, bring it to Virginia. I'm gonna get a letter.
Yeah, that's right.
Gonna be too